Yeah.
Thank you so much, Malcolm.
Okay, so my name is Shane Theunissen. I'm a professor in child and youth study at Mount Saint Vincent University. My first introduction to communities of practice was a good probably 20, if not more, years ago when I was doing my master's degree in education, and I was focusing on sort of apprenticeship models of learning and looking at the mechanisms that learning, through which learning happens within various communities. Now, the term community of practice took a long time to get into sort of the mainstream conversation. And when we think about a community of practice, it can be a group of people that are working towards a collective end, or let's say perhaps people that are sharing a collective interest. So that we're going to use that as our sort of our working definition for community of practice. The term was sort of coined by a couple of researchers, just in case you want to make reference to them. It's Lave and Wenger. So they're the folks that coined that. Nancy's very familiar with them. So if you need to get sort of a book citation in order to be able to reference this work, she could certainly be able to provide that to you. If you want to just put it to the next slide there, Nancy.
Yeah, I can do that. I think I can. There we go.
All right. So there's a academic term, like when you're doing research, and it's actually called triangulation. And the intention of triangulation is to make your data more rigorous, let's say, or more valid and legitimate. So those words, they carry a lot of power with them. So if you making knowledge or information that isn't legitimate, then you don't really want to be using that information to guide your decision making. And so when we spoke about this idea of like looking at communities of practice and optimizing the learning potential within communities of practice, I don't have a lot of time to speak about it, but I thought like I could start out with this 6 Blind Men and an Elephant. Now, this is a poem. If you Google it, it's probably about 300 years old, this poem. But what they're doing is they're talking about these various blindfolded men or blind folks that are coming to this elephant, and they're feeling different parts of the elephant. So you can see one person is touching the tusk, and they're like, oh yes, this is a spear. And then another one's touching the trunk, and they're saying, oh yeah, this is a snake. And with the various aspects, the trunk, the leg is a trunk of a tree, so they think it's a tree. And they all seeing the elephant from these different perspectives. And each one of them fundamentally feels as though their perspective is the right perspective, okay, the correct perspective. And the poem actually ends that with these 6 blind folks arguing with each other about whose point is the right point. And it says, they were all partially right, but they were all wrong, right? And that's there's a really interesting message in that, in terms of, valuing the diversity of perspectives that exist, right? So when we think like the ultimate message from the idea of working within communities of practice is to look at, how can we utilize the diversity of the perspectives that exist and promote, collaboration amongst those perspectives, so that we don't argue long and loud about how our perspective is the right perspective, but we open up our minds and our hearts, etc., to understanding alternative perspectives, so that we can use those perspectives to make like a collaborative truth or collaborative understanding of a situation. So I think this image is quite useful for that. So we can have a quick look at the historical kinds of ways that communities of practices have been seen before. If you want to go to the next slide there, if you don't mind. Just click it one more time, and I think an image will come up on the left-hand side there. Oh, there we go. So when we think about a community of practice, this is the typical model of the community of practice, where you have the core, and the core is where the power resides within the community. Those are seen to be the members of the community that have the most legitimacy, the most power in that community of practice. So remember, this is a historical perspective, or like, you know, the accepted idea of what a community of practice should look like. And so usually that core creates the rules and the structures of that community. And someone who's on the periphery, they have less power than the folks that are in the core. And in order for them to be able to gain power, they need to conform to the norms and the standards that the core is creating. Okay, so when we think historically about communities of practice and sort of management strategies that have been used within organizations, oftentimes those rules and the normative ways of being within that community have been determined by that core group of people. And, you know, that core group of people actually represents only one perspective of how things could possibly operate. Right. So on the side, they tying into this like sort of apprenticeship model of learning. Like if I'm apprenticing in a community, then I'm participating in that community and I'm conforming to the norms of that community. And that's often how we see apprenticeship learning happening. Like you see the apprentice following the journeyman, and they're learning by becoming part of that person's community. And that's what I've got there on the side. Things I must earn. Time. Like people commit time to the community and they learn the norms of that community through the time that they spend there, and they conform to the norms of that community and they get more power. So, you know, when you think about who's been at the 5D organization the longest, oftentimes those people are seen to have the greatest legitimacy. Whereas newcomers to the community often are seen to have less legitimacy because they've put in less time and they aren't aware of the numerous structures that exist in there that they actually learn as a consequence of the association and affiliation with that context. So that represents the historical model where one perspective represented by the core determines the rules for the group. And as we can tell from that elephant example, if we only have one perspective informing a problem, we may not necessarily get the whole picture. Okay, so if you want to put it forward to the next slide there. Mm-hmm. And again, just to see if we can get the picture showing. There we go. So here we got something called the legitimate peripheral participation. So remember, I said people on the periphery had less power. But what happens if you sort of recognize that people that are on the periphery, although the core or the hegemon doesn't see that perspective as being legitimate, what happens if we do see that perspective as legitimate? So all of a sudden, instead of just the core determining the norms for the community, you can say, well, what is your perspective coming from the periphery? I know that you're a newcomer here. What do you see that we've become? Oftentimes I use the word nose blind, you know, when they're using the advertisement, like you become nose blind to something. We may become blind to structures that exist, and we're just so used to them that we don't see them anymore, right? So a newcomer to that space may actually say, well, you know, because I'm new here, I can question some of these structures, and I don't take them at face value like you do, or, you know, have become blind to them. I'm not blind to them as you are. So I may be able to bring your attention to things that you don't necessarily see anymore. And that brings us another alternative perspective, right? So when we start thinking about communities of practice, that idea of having the hegemon have power really limits the perspective from which we can see things. If we start opening up to share that legitimacy and seeing who can provide perspectives onto the problem at hand, the more of those perspectives we can bring together, the better off we're going to be. So this model here actually shows, like community A might be what was historically that core of the community, and that community that I have there is B, would be the periphery. And each person is they call it boundary crossing. They're actually working to gain legitimacy in each other's community. So the members of community A, they need to understand how the periphery understands the context. So they need to work to gain that understanding. And the people that were on the periphery need to work to gain the understanding of the core. So both groups are having to work to gain an understanding of each other. Okay, and that's a really important piece, like that the work that we put into understanding each other's perspectives is like when we think about building consensus. I really put the emphasis on that idea of building, because building is work, and we need to work to understand other people's perspectives so that we can come to an agreement about a way of seeing the situation or seeing the problems that exist, or like the elements that surround us, let's say. If you want to put it on to the next slide there, Nancy. So here we've got optimizing your professional knowledge base. So when we think about this, I've got that little image there of the different people holding the different pieces of the puzzle, and we've got their consensus models or co-construction of knowledge, right? So I spoke about this consensus, building this agreement around what we see. If we go back to those folks that are touching the various parts of the elephant, if they could build a consensus and actually collaborate with each other, then they could start seeing what they were blind to. And it's when we start seeing what we are blind to that we become more aware of the full nature of what exists around us. And the full nature of the potential of an organization will be realized when we actually have that more comprehensive understanding brought to us from this multitude of viewpoints, right? So that's that consensus model of knowledge, or oftentimes people talk about co-construction, where we build it together and we build this understanding of what this is together. And oftentimes, these types of processes take time, and they often aren't prioritized because they are seen as inefficient, right? But the space where they gain their legitimacy is when they come up with comprehensive solutions and not ad hoc solutions that only demonstrate one perspective. Now, a really important component of this process of building consensus, or this co-construction of knowledge, is this idea of humility, right? Like where we don't, I actually tell my kids that, certainty is a kind of stupidity, right? Like it's a kind of ignorance. When you're absolutely certain about something, you're closing off every other option that might exist for that particular space. And that's what those people with that elephant were doing. Like they were absolutely certain about their viewpoint. So in order to be able to understand, and I use the phrase empathic understanding, so that's understanding from another person's viewpoint, their perspective, then we need to be humble and acknowledge that maybe the way that we do things isn't the only way or the right way to do things. And that embodies that element of humility that's absolutely essential to this process of consensus building. And when I sent the slides to Nancy, I said, the subtitle to it was a very brief discussion. I tried to speak as quickly as I could, but I could probably talk on this topic for an hour or two and not run out of steam. So I did at the beginning of this presentation say to Nancy that, if you guys do have some questions that you'd like to ask, or you want to see some more concrete examples, I'm more than happy to meet with folks at another time to sort of build on this understanding of communities of practice and this sort of collaborative approach to knowledge making and knowledge building. But with that, I do have to go. I have another appointment that I really have to run off to. But I want to thank Nancy for this opportunity for me to be able to share this work that I do with everyone here. And I really hope that maybe we can touch base again sometime in the future and have more conversations around it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Nancy.